Hello and welcome to Duncan Toplis On Air. I'm Caroline Cleary, the Chief Marketing Officer at Duncan Toplis, and I'm joined today by my colleague Niall Kingsley, who is our Head of Charities and also Director at Duncan Toplis. We're going to be discussing various things today around the charities sector, but also the recently released UK Charities Report that we've co-authored as part of the Kreston Global Network. Welcome, Niall.
Hi, Caroline.
So I suppose for listeners who aren't as familiar with your role or what the charities sector looks like, it might be worth you just running through what is your role as Head of Charities?
Yes, so at Duncan Toplis, we've had a long history of supporting charities, helping them with their sort of compliance and reporting, as well as advising on their governance and structures. In terms of my role, really, it's just to continue to drive forward our work in the not-for-profit sector, to encourage and train others to become involved at Duncan Toplis with the charity sector, and I guess be our public face, which includes such as provisions of webinars, blogs, and other charity-specific news releases, deal with incoming charity inquiries, and I think also just to work with our sort of fantastic charity specialists from across the firm and our technical and compliance team members to just share our experience and drive our sort of quality and consistency of our charity offering.
Yeah, and you head up that sort of sector expertise in lots of ways, and there's lots of benefits for clients in having a team that are able to specialise in this way. But in terms of the team that you have, what is it that excites them about the charities sector? Why do they enjoy that type of work?
I just think there's a real satisfaction in supporting the not-for-profit sector. Part of our sort of aims and values is to sort of impact the communities and the world around us. And I think particularly this sector, you get a real sense of actually achieving something and supporting the clients doing good work. And
real effort made recently in terms of the Kreston UK Charities Report, which you've co-authored. A lot of expertise in that report. And what were your initial thoughts on the findings of this year's report?
Yeah, so, firstly, I'd like to thank all those who participated in the survey. As you've said, I was sort of representative on the Kreston UK Charities group, and we do work collectively together to sort of share knowledge and our experience from acting for many thousands of clients, charity clients across the UK. As you say, we've all collaborated together to produce this 2024 report. I think overall it's pleasing to see the positivity for the future, despite the challenging backdrop that there is of the sort of rising costs and uncertainties around funding. I think the results were broadly in line with what we expected to see and from what we've been hearing from our clients over the last 12 months. I think many of the charity surveys were facing the same challenges, but actually from feedback I've had from my clients that have read the report, it's actually some comfort to them that they aren't alone and that other charities are facing exactly the same challenges that they are.
And I suppose with the outcomes, it's worth just drilling into what you find the key highlights. So you've identified some challenges there that are recognised by your own clients, but what are the biggest takeouts?
So I think charities are overwhelmingly facing increased pressures on funding, and also obviously rising costs, particularly in wages, rent and insurance, with the three sort of categories identified. There's difficulties in attracting and recruiting employees and volunteers. Those persist. They're not necessarily a new emerging issue. It's something that's been a familiar theme in recent years. And also just sort of filling the skills gaps and diversity within the charities boards. I think that despite that, and in contrast of some of those challenges, almost half of the charities believe there was the financial outlook is positive for 2024. So that was pleasing to see in terms of their sort of attitudes and positivities about the future.
And I suppose we sit here in Q1 of the new financial year. What do you see as the biggest cost increases for charities in the coming period?
In terms of the cost increases, I think we've mentioned, I think 81% of the charities that responded to the survey have seen wage increases during the last 12 months. 76% have seen energy cost increases, and 78% have seen insurance cost increases. So very similar pattern to what we've seen in the business environment. Charities are certainly, equally impacted by those rising costs and cost of inflation. Probably less so in terms of interest rates, although perhaps in terms of their income from investment, that's been sort of impacted on the flip side. Obviously, charities don't tend to have a huge amount of borrowing, so it's more on the income side of that. Rent appears to have bucked that trend slightly. Most of the respondents have said that their rent had broadly remained the same. But wages is obviously a significant cost for a lot of service-based charities that aren't able to rely on volunteers. And charities, like other businesses, have had to respond to the cost of living crisis that their employees face, but also, have had to increase wages to attract and retain those employees.
And I suppose with cost increases across the board, that leads to struggles and challenges in other areas. With the charities that you've spoken to and those that have completed the survey in the report, what are the main struggles that they're finding?
So obviously, it is positive that a large number of our respondents had a positive outlook. Should also be noted that 57% had a sort of neutral or negative outlook, which shows there is also concerns there. We know uncertainty around income and funding going forward is and also in the recent past has been a challenge for a lot of charities. There's a lot since COVID. A lot of new charities were formed. There's obviously been other global events around that, and cost of living pressures within the UK. So there is a scramble for a higher number of people going for the same funding. And with cost of living, it's, corporate or individual donors may not have the same funds available. There's more competition for grant funding, and government funding generally has been more sparse than it perhaps once was due to the economic environment. I think 83% of charities surveyed said they're facing pressures on their income streams. And the majority are now exploring ways to diversify that income and look to the future and how they can gain some sense of security going forward. And obviously, all of that comes at a time of sort of rising costs and at a time when demand for their services has been increasing. All of that makes it difficult and a bit draining on charities' reserves. So I think they are carefully looking at sort of longer term budgeting and cash flow forecasts. That's become more and more essential for them, having a bit of a longer term as well as short term view. And I think they're challenged by looking carefully about what services they're able to continue or which need to be prioritised in the current climate.
So a lot of decision making coming into the charity arena, and some significant challenges that you've outlined there as well. What would be your advice? What would be your recommendation for charities who are perhaps looking at these challenges and thinking, how are we going to build that future fit organisation?
So we mentioned one of the challenges the charities have mentioned having is finding it difficult not only to recruit and retain employees, but also to sort of diversify their charities boards, their board of trustees, to get the right mix of skills and experience. And I think a few of them I did identify a few skills gaps there. I think particularly in sort of HR, sort of legal and IT seem to be the most mentioned in terms of missing skills. I do think it's important to keep doing that. So to have those conversations, to promote the charities and continue that fight to get that diverse and highly skilled board, that feeds back into that better forecasting and planning and strategic decision making.
And is there a point in all of that a business advisor becomes a necessity? So you've talked about building the board, building that base where they can start to meet these challenges and consider the future. The inquiries that we do tend to get at Duncan and Toplis are charities who have questions around their next steps. At what stage should a charity be reaching out if they've not already done so?
I think, as with any business or management team of any sort, I think to be cognizant of where your own skills might be lacking. Have you got diverse views in the room? And one way of doing that is to, whether that's with an accountant or other advisors or professionals, just to, always be open to reaching out, having those conversations, taking in those new ideas and seeing where they lead.
So we've talked a little bit around the financial picture, a bit around structure and the leadership required to be a charity in the modern day, all the challenges that come with that. If we think a little bit about risks, do you see risks on the horizon for charities?
We've talked about challenges securing funding going forward, and that was by far the biggest risk identified by our respondents. I touched on some reasons why that might be before. I think following that, obviously the staffing related cost pressures are definitely there, and I've also mentioned the increased demand for services following COVID, and then the cost of living crisis. The demand and reliance on the charities sector has been immense, and is clearly not expected to ease up soon by our respondents. That shows just what a critical sector, how critical the charity sector is to the UK in delivering vital services. Another reason why supporting that sector as an accountant gives immense satisfaction, as I mentioned before. Following that, the uncertain political landscape was the next highest scorer. Whether that's down to concerns over future funding, uncertainty, what global events might come down the road next and hit us, or lack of confidence that's sort of held over since the famous mini budget we had, which had so much economic impact.
So I suppose in summary, it's for listeners to grab hold of a copy of the report and have a look at the findings in there. I believe there's a copy on our website, so that's duncantoplis.co.uk. But perhaps for those who haven't read it yet or haven't quite got down to the detail, how would you summarise the findings and what that means for the sector?
So it's a mixture of sort of positivity and resilience, but an openness to the shared challenges that charities are facing, particularly around that retention and recruitment in volunteers, in employees, in trustees. I think there was a general sense following COVID, with a lot of people taking early retirement, that actually that would bring a lot of people into the charities sector, whether that be in a trustee position or as a volunteer role. But that's not quite seemed to have had the impact that was perhaps hoped for. Charities are obviously looking at how they can attract employees with more incentives. Obviously, the main one that was identified out of the survey was obviously increasing salaries, but also offering that sort of more flexible hybrid working. It'll be interesting to see whether they look at other incentives, and I feel perhaps a little bit still behind sort of diverse range of benefits and incentives that you get in the business sector. So that might be something we start to see more of. I suppose if I had to pick one area that I was a little bit surprised about in terms of the responses, was that most charities will not be focusing so much on ESG and sustainability in 2024. In some ways, that's perhaps not a surprise given the challenges that they've got at the moment that perhaps they're prioritising. I do wonder if we'll start to see the response change if we ask that question again over the next 1 to 3 years. I think we know in the general business world that's a key area of focus and a growing driver of sort of consumer choice. I just wonder whether grant funders and donors will place the same emphasis on that when making their decision, and would early action takers in the charity sector in that area win out when it comes to sort of standing out and securing that funding. I guess time will tell on that.
It certainly sounds like one to watch, doesn't it? And just to thank you really for exploring that so comprehensively with us. It's a lot of work to put the report together, but it's also really interesting to be able to benchmark the charity sector and look at those trends. So thank you so much for sharing that with us today, Neil.
Pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for having me.